by looking at what perception actually is, how specifically it's defined. It's important to do that often. We'll look at how it's accomplished. We know a good bit about that, even though perception is really narrow and really idiosyncratic. You know, it's your eyes, your ears, and so on. But nevertheless, we know a lot about how it's accomplished. One of the key ways it's accomplished is by watching and recording other people. We could fess that up and make it real fancy, but that's really what it amounts to. One of the things we watch is other people a lot. Many of us prefer that, and we have to make sense of it. And our book briefly talks about this, and I'm going to add to this as well, a theory of how we make sense of stuff we see. So this is the outline, and really point number 3 and 4 will be the second part. I'm going to talk about the intro and how perception is accomplished. But first things first. What is perception? Perception, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt right away and say, if this is your first lecture, you can hit pause anytime you want. You can watch it multiple times. You can watch it more than multiple times if you don't have a lot going on in your life, but please feel free to do that. So what is perception? There's a formal definition. This one's not much different than the one in our book. It's the process by which we select, organize, and interpret input into our senses. Let's take it apart. First is selection. What do we select? There's so many things going on. I don't know what's happening where you are now, but I've got a window to the outside. It's beautiful outside. I'm thinking about outside. I've got a fan on. I've got music in the background. I've got this computer. There's other people coming in and out. There's a lot going on. What do we select? That's important to know. Now, even if we select the same thing to look at, it doesn't mean we organize it in the same way. Organize means we have to parse it out, figure out what's going on. And miracle enough, let's assume we select the very same thing out of a complex environment, organize it in the very same way. Doesn't mean we interpret it in the same way. Often interpretations veer off depending on various features, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So all along this, perception, in other words, is a process, and all along this process there are ways for variance to occur in what we see and perceive. So a lot of our prior experience, if you look at impressions that we have of people, they influence our subsequent interaction with them. Even our knowledge base, whether we're fully up to speed on something or not so much, that affects it. What we pay attention to, our mood affects that. There's quite a few things that affect perception. But what I want to convince you of, I hope I'm going to convince you of here, is that perception is really important in the workplace. It affects all kinds of things. And so the first way I'll start out to try to prove this to you is that perception can play a role in work behaviors such as performance appraisals. No one likes a performance appraisal. I don't know any employee on the globe that says, gee whiz, could I have another performance appraisal this quarter? People don't want that. But yet performance appraisals perception plays a big role in those appraisals. If you think about, let's say you've got 7 employees that work for you, that's quite a big span of control there. And say your company does evaluations twice a quarter, twice a year, excuse me. That's still 14 evaluations. And boy, think about that, what you'd have to do. You've got to think back over the previous 6 months and, geez, what did Betsy do? What did Bill do? Let alone the other remaining of your 7 employees. It's a lot of work, and it relies on your memory a lot. And memory, in turn, relies on perception. You can see what I'm getting at. There's lots of room for problems in this equation. You think about decision making. It's the same thing. Decision making most people think of decision making as that final step. You know, you're going to buy a car and you're going to decide between the CR-V or the RAV. But in fact, decision making is a whole series of steps that starts with you selecting options in the first place. What if you fail to see or perceive options that someone else does? Well, you're going to be fouled up. Interviews are the same thing. Interviews, people generally think they're very, very good at interviews. But what you've already read, I think, in our book, you may not have encountered it yet, is that interviews are very, very poor ways to perceive other people. And paired with the fact that we really believe that interviews are good and that some of us, that we're really good at it and that we trust our perceptions, it's not a winning combination. In fact, interviews are poor ways to perceive other people, in large part because an interview is manufactured anyway. You know, employees, you prepare for an interview. You're not yourself. You prepare, and people wonder, well, why didn't you prepare? You mean you didn't practice questions and come up with fake answers? So it's a bit of a construction anyway. And ditto for the company. They're not going to completely fess up with, gee whiz, we had 3 sexual harassment cases the last quarter, but we think we have our act together. And they're not going to do that. So it adds to the problem of perception, makes it more difficult, the fact that people aren't leveling during an interview. So perception plays a role there. Let's jump up a level and look at actual work in progress. Most of us have managers, most all of us do, and you manage your employees. And there are often perception gaps between managers and employees. And these gaps can manifest themselves in a bunch of different ways and can leave people unhappy, dissatisfied. One of the studies done of this very thing, and I'll show you this, there's a lot of research talked about in our book. It's a very, very important norm in the field to look at research, and no surprise, there's tons of research on perception, which I'm talking about right now. One of these studies was done quite a long while ago by a guy named Likert. He worked for AT&T. At the time, it was the largest company on the planet, about 1.25 million employees. And they were concerned actually then with human resources and doing things right because they had so many people. So they commissioned Likert to do this study of supervisors and subordinates. And he did a whole set of complex stuff, and I'm just going to pull out a couple of the things he looked at. In fact, just one. In one part of his study, he looked at managers, supervisors, and subordinates, and these were matched. So it was the same supervisor-subordinate pair. And he asked them simple questions. He asked the supervisor, what do you do after someone succeeds? They do something good. And then he asked subordinates, well, what does your manager do after you do something good? So he got their perspective about the very same event, ostensibly. And then what he did was collate this. Remember, the study is very complex, so I'm just pulling out a simple part of the study. He took all these things that people said, and he categorized them into various types of recognition. And you're staring at those right now. So let's take that first row, gives privileges. So the supervisor said that after an employee does something good, about 50%, 52% exactly of the time, he kind of gives privileges, or she gives privileges. Now the subordinates disagree with that. They say that only happens about 14% of the time. And you can see what else Likert recorded gives more responsibility, better training, other rewards, and so on. So I don't know what catches your eye about this data, but what catches my eye are these 2 rows I've just highlighted here. And what you'll see is this is a huge difference. Now, one criticism of the study is well, gee whiz, as managers, you don't have the resources or the wherewithal that every time somebody does something good to give them some reward. That's true. It can be expensive. You run out of rewards pretty quick. But you know what? Take a look at these 2 rows here. I think giving people a pat on the back doesn't cost anything, or praising them. Hey, what a great job. I think that's pretty free. But yet, that's where we see the biggest gap in perception among paired supervisors and subordinates. That to me is pretty fascinating, and I don't know what conclusions you draw, but what I see is that perception is important. And one theme throughout our book, and I'll highlight here too, is that in many cases, who knows what happened here? You'd have to follow these people around all the time. Who knows what reality is? But in some ways, it doesn't matter. A big theme in our book is that perception often trumps reality, because what people think they saw is how they're going to act, not what's really there, what people think is really there. So perception plays this role at a micro level. It plays a role when you jump up a level and look at managers and employees interacting. Even at a sort of a national and organizational level, certainly, but at a national level too, I want to prove the importance of perception. And I noticed that most people in class were Americans, but it doesn't matter. We could substitute the nationality and the same principles apply. But the perception of Americans is a place where also perception plays a role. And again, if perception is queen or king, That is, if people act on their perceptions rather than what's really there, then it's important to know what those perceptions are. And it turns out we have some data on how Americans are perceived by other people. I pulled some of these quotes. These are very, very rich quotes. I'll share some data in a very quick second here, but take a look at this one here. This is by an Italian auto designer, and you know, Italians have a stereotypic reputation of being very stylistic and so on, and this kind of illustrates that too. If this designer said, gee whiz, if you're going to make something, a million of something, yeah, do it in the U.S. They're very good at that. But if you're going to make only one, do it here in Italy. I'll just put a couple more of these up, and you can read them or stop this recording at your leisure. But here's Carlos Fuentes. He's a Nobel Prize-winning writer, and what he said is, gee, what the U.S. does best is understand itself. What it does worst is understand others. And that's really interesting, as is that Akio Morita quote. He's the former chair of Sony Corporation. He lived in the U.S. for years and had some sensibilities that extended across continents. And you can see what he says too. And what Fuentes and Morita are saying is that sometimes Americans are very, very critical, and particularly of themselves, and so maybe they do understand themselves pretty well and can communicate that, but then they have some challenges extending this to other people. That can often be misperceived. You know, people look at Americans, oh, they're fighting all the time, but it often can be very functional. But let's look at some actual data, though. Time magazine did a study not long ago. They didn't do it. They commissioned Gallup to do it, and they asked a national sample of various folks in countries across the globe what they thought of Americans. And they gave them the opportunity, they gave them a long list of traits, a long list of positive and a long list of negative ones. And people were asked to choose from among this list. And so here are some results. Take the Brazilians. And remember, this isn't just a convenient sample of a couple hundred people at a mall. This is a national probability sample of Brazilians. One we can have some confidence in represents the nation itself. And so what you see there is the Brazilians, they're allowed to choose 5 of these things the most often and only 4 of the least often. I don't know why they did that, but it looks like the Brazilians think Americans are intelligent, inventive, energetic, and so on, but also greedy, a theme you'll see later in views of Americans. And traits least often associated with Americans are not viewed as lazy by the Brazilians, and some other features there too. I don't know why those showed up. Here are the same. I'm going to put them all up. There's no surprise here. No need to hold these back in advance from me. Here you can take a look at these in more detail at your leisure. But what you'll see is there is some consistency across nationalities in views of Americans. And even if there's not, if the Japanese think we're nationalistic, I think what we can expect is their behavior, if we're negotiating with them for various deals or trade deals, can reflect some of those beliefs. You know, finally, probably the most recent data, actually this is 2011, I updated it, the source says 2008, but Pew Charitable Trust collects this data every 3 years. These also are national probability samples of large numbers of countries, and I chose some of the characteristics that they assessed about Americans. A lot of people think Americans are hardworking. Many people think they're inventive. We've got some problems in the honesty category. In fact, look at the very top of that list. Americans themselves, as Fuentes had foreshadowed, that Carlos Fuentes said, very critical of oneself. We think we're honest, but boy, if you're evaluating yourself, wouldn't that be closer to 100%? So my point here, I'm going to skip that next one. You can pause if you want. My point here is that people do have some views of Americans, just as they have views of Chinese, of Saudis, of other people around the globe. And people act on these perceptions. I'm not saying they're true. I mean, who knows if they're true or not. But the point is perception does trump reality quite often. I'll finish, and I think I've already made my point, but I'll finish my point by saying that let's jump up yet another level, and let's look at time. So we've gone from very, very micro things, now we're out to time. Well, time is very macro, right? In fact, there's probably nothing more objective than time, is there? I don't care where you are on the planet, everybody is on the same time system. You can figure that out. We're all in Greenwich Mean Time. Everybody has trains and planes and other things that operate on time schedules. So, you know, if anything, there should be very little, if any, difference in the perception of time because it is so objective. In fact, it's one of the most unassailably objective things around because of that consistency. So the rationale here for researchers was, boy, if we find differences in perception of how people view and value time, well, then it really does, once again, highlight the value of studying perception. Well, people have studied this, and they've looked at how people value time across cultures. And I'll mention one study, although this guy is a source of a ton of studies about perception of time. And he did a very clever thing. His name is Levine, and you may see his name because this has been popularized in various sources. But he looked at the pace of time, and you got to give this guy credit because how do you actually measure time or people's views and perceptions of time? So it's one of the cleverest things about his study. He came up with a whole bunch of measures that were proxies for how people valued time, and you're staring at 3 of them right now, and I'll describe those. He came up with a whole bunch of measures that were proxies for how people valued time, and you're staring at 3 of them right now, and I'll describe those. The first is bank clock accuracy, and again, you have to give the guy some credit. His rationale was basically this, is that, boy, given the financial community values time a lot, as you well know, the time value of money is one of the key features of any understanding of finance, that bank clock should be extremely accurate, and they should be accurate across the globe. There should be no differences in that. So he took a measure of that. What he in fact did, and anybody could do this at any time, he just bought one of those cheap atomic clocks at Radio Shack. You can get it for 25 bucks, and you can get time down to very, very precise measures. He also indexed what he called walking speed, and it was literally that. What Levine did was he'd take samples of all these measures and others I'm not talking about. He'd take samples in a whole bunch of different countries, Japan, US, UK, Indonesia, and so on. And I've only given you a sample of various countries here. His sample's much larger in his study. But what he did, let's take Japan for example. What he did is in 6 of the major cities in Japan, he would take samples of bank clock accuracy, a sample of about 30 of those in each of the big cities. So he'd go to Yokohama and get samples of bank clock accuracy at various times in the day, and he had a lot of control, as you might want in a really good study. What he also did was index walking speed. So in these cities, so let's take Yokohama again, he would, in Center City, and he did a lot of control for those, he would literally measure off with masking tape 100 feet. And then he would sit in the shadows surreptitiously recording samples of people, how quickly they would traverse that 100 feet. So the third measure then is post office speed. And again, it's kind of clever. If people value time, maybe they'd be manifested in these various measures. So post office speed, what he did is he went to post offices, and again, in various cities in all these countries, taking a fairly large sample. He'd present with the equivalent of a $5 bill in their currency. He'd ask for the equivalent of a first-class stamp, and then he just clocked how long that took to get service. So here are the results. Let's just look at this first column. So the Japanese valued time more than anybody in the sample. They were #1, and even in this little subset that I pulled out from his study. U.S. kind of closely followed behind that. The Indonesians were last here. So the difference in the accuracy of bank clocks, where seconds make a huge difference, was huge. The Indonesian clocks were off by an average of about 25 seconds. The Japanese less than a second. We're talking really, really precise calibrating. I'll show you the others here quickly too, and you can see that the Japanese were #1 in many of the indicants, and certainly these 3 I'm sharing with you. Let's take walking speed. The Japanese, on average, traversed this 100 feet in about 20 seconds. Try it. That's a pretty good clip. Whereas the Taiwanese and Indonesians took closer to 28 seconds. And you may say, well, geez, that's not a very big difference, but that's about 40% difference. My goodness, that's a huge difference. If I'm presented with a mutual fund that's going to return 40% more, I'm going to go with that. So it is a pretty big difference, and the same with post office speed. So you can see what I'm saying here. no matter where you look, it looks like perception has these effects, from narrow things, from interpersonal, managers and subordinates, to views of people across cultures, to even to something that's unassailably as objective as time. We see perception is important. It's important to look at because there's variance. If all stock funds returned the same, we would need to categorize them and monitor them closely. Variance is important in any field. It's important here in perception too. So how is it accomplished? How is perception done? Well, we know a decent amount about this. And if you'll give me a little bit of poetic license, I'm going to put them into two separate categories. Now, in reality, everything's mushed together, but researchers are able to separate these more clearly. And again, if you'll give me a little bit of flexibility here, I've separated them two for purposes of discussion. Let's look at the first one. Let's look at external sources of influence. If perception is important for all those reasons I talked about, what's driving our perceptions? It looks like, in some cases, that a lot of it has to do with the environment itself, the external environment. Maybe something just draws our attention in, or something begets us to perceive it and process it and organize it. Those external sources. I'll give you a couple examples. One is size. It turns out our attention is more likely to be drawn to bigger stimuli. And people have said, well, there's an evolutionary reason for this. Big things are more dangerous. It doesn't really matter. The point is that these things are not lost on advertisers, for example, right? Big, colorful, and the corollary to size is intensity. Intense stimuli grab our attention. Again, very, very basic principles of advertising these days. I guess I'd be hard-pressed to talk about a standard type of commercial, but if you were, the sort of prototypic commercial these days, at least in the U.S., are really, really colorful commercials that move very, very quickly, right? Lots of colors, lots of people. There's skateboards, there's people on beaches, and there's all these colors on, and Mountain Dew, right? At the very end of the commercial, you see Mountain Dew. So not much content in the message, in the advertising, but really colorful, grabs your attention, and eventually you get to what you want to draw people's attention to, which is Mountain Dew. So size begets our perceptions. Another thing about the environment, external environment, is primacy. Primacy refers to early stimuli or early views. The sooner you see something, the more likely it is. Or said more precisely, you can read it here, but initial pieces of information that you get about someone or something have a bigger effect. They have a bigger effect. It's often called the anchoring effect as well, but the primacy effect, the anchor, the starting point, often inordinately affects the end point, in this case your evaluation of somebody. An example I give you is what we know about interviews is that a lot of interviewers, I'm not going to bore you with the data and how we got it, but a lot of interviews decide in the first 5 minutes whether or not a job candidate is a good prospect. And they make up their mind. The same is true for a lot of customers. Often they make their minds up about hotels and et cetera, and they go to Dorothy Lane or some other market. They make up their mind very, very quickly what they think about it. So people jump to these conclusions, these primacy effects, and they're very difficult to override later. Another thing about the environment and the way it's set up is what's called a contrast effect. And a contrast effect has to do with the way stuff is set up out there that you're processing. And if we're processing a lot of information about people, excuse me one second here, about people, you may be subject to a contrast effect. And it has to do with the way information is set up in the environment. That's a little bit archaic. But let me just say that our environment, objects, people, whatever, can sometimes shape, distort, draw our attention to that particular target. Stuff around what we're trying to process, what it contrasts with. It still probably didn't do a good job. So let me give you a couple examples. Well, I'll just give you one example of this. Take a look at this right here. Maybe you've seen this visual illusion before. It's a well-known visual illusion that I redrew here in PowerPoint. And what people typically ask about, if you can watch my cursor here, is a researcher might ask, well, what do you think of the size of this particular circle versus this one? Right. And people inevitably say to a very high degree that this circle is smaller than this one. It certainly appears that way. It's not. And often when I'm in class and I show this to people, they say, oh, yeah, this one's definitely smaller. You can't, no. And so I'll bring PowerPoint down, and since I created this, I literally bring this circle over on top of this one, and you can see it's a perfect fit. These are identical. I made them up. But yet this one appears much bigger, and it's because of what it contrasts with, its environment, what surrounds it. These are much bigger. This appears smaller, and so on. My analogy, you can see, is complete, that often people say, take minority group members in any culture, often report that their behavior is more closely scrutinized. Say you're in a meeting and you're the only minority member. Folks say that my behavior is looked at more closely. People watch me, because I stand out, I contrast. And whether that's fair or not is not really relevant. It's probably not fair. But you see this sometimes in genderized occupations, where if you're a woman in a typically male occupation, that same thing is sort of reported. But whether it is fair or not, and most people believe it's unfair, it does happen. So those are the external sources. Sometimes just the way the environment is set up can influence and draw our attention to something. All right. So we know a good bit about those. Those are easier to study. The more insidious things, but the more important ones, as is often the case with humans and in life, the things that are harder to get your fingers on are the ones that are most important. And that's true about perception too. So often internal sources, the way we take information in and then play with it or organize it is a more common way perception is accomplished. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but I will do that during the next part of the lecture, and I encourage you to watch that